Hello, I'm Philip Chase. Welcome to my YouTube channel on the best of fantasy. Today, we're going to be discussing George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. Not to be confused, of course, with the HBO series A Game of Thrones, which is based on the book series. So I'd like to discuss exactly what makes A Song of Ice and Fire one of the greatest fantasy works of all time, even as it is unfinished. George R.R. Martin is in many ways a great model for an aspiring writer, not only of fantasy, but of any kind, and for several reasons that I want to discuss today. So he's a great writer to look at and see what he does, because he does a lot of things really well. Reading the prose of a great writer is like listening to a Bach cello suite, or watching Roger Federer play tennis, or drinking a really fine scotch. There's so much range and grace and subtlety and depth and majesty and nuance. These are books that one can read and read again, savoring many of the sentences along the way. And George R.R. Martin is really up there. So what exactly makes his writing great? Well, to begin with, he has obviously done a lot of reading. Of course, this applies to reading that is directly related to his books, in other words, research. It's quite obvious that the man is very well read in terms of medieval history and warfare, and he has intimate knowledge. It's evident of things like the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses. These were tumultuous times that in many ways mirror the violence of Martin's world. It's a bit like reading the chronicles of Froissart, who wrote about the 100 Years' War, described all kinds of acts of brutality. So Martin has borrowed from cultures of the past to present something authentic in his world building. And he's not just well read, I suspect, in books that are directly related to his field. I think, like every other great writer, Martin is probably well read in general. Great writers are, as a rule, voracious readers. And to put it in the words of Matthew Arnold, they read the best that has been thought and said. So, if you want to be a great writer in fantasy, well, read about, cosmology or neuroscience, or read fiction in other fields, read the greats. Just read and read voraciously. That will only make you a better writer. And this is because being well read will enable you to be a wonderful world builder, which is imperative in fantasy. Just look at Martin's world with its various languages. You can learn Dothraki if you want, or Valyrian. Look at the various cultures that he has created, the history of this place going back centuries and centuries, and even millennia. And if you care to, you can even read some of the extra books about Martin's world, like Fire and Blood, where you learn all about the history of the Targaryens. And there are maps and so many other elements to this world that it provides total immersion for the reader. Another thing that Martin does brilliantly would be his characters. These characters are vivid and complex, and most of all, conflicted. When I was thinking about what to say in this video, I remember something that William Faulkner once said in a speech, to the effect that there's nothing worth writing about but the human heart in conflict with itself. I think I got that quote more or less right. And when I was researching the quote, I found that actually George R.R. Martin had tweeted this very quote about a year ago. So it's something that he obviously has in mind. Conflict. Very important for interesting characters. So, for example, if you look at Jon Snow, this is a guy who's torn between his family and his duty, his sworn duty at the wall. Or look at Daenerys Targaryen. Early on, she's torn between her loyalty to her brother and her growing independence. And later on, of course, as she becomes more and more powerful, the conflict is between her desire to do good in the world, make the world a better place, and the grim reality that having power means doing some really terrible things. And there's Eddard Stark, who is torn between his family and his desire to just be home, and his loyalty toward King Robert and the truth. And also there's Jaime Lannister, who is later torn between his family and his desire to be a better person as a result of some of the experiences that he's been through. So I could go on and on. Every single major character in Martin's work has at least one major conflict, if not several. And so often these conflicts are about a cynical realism versus an idealism. And this is really the Game of Thrones that the characters engage in, the deadly game. And also the details that he puts into the characters really make them stand out. This applies even to minor characters. For example, one of my favorites, Syrio Forel, the swordmaster who teaches Arya. Brilliantly sketched character. In just a few pages, it's amazing what Martin can do. He gives them all distinct voices, and he's so darn good at it that he can kill them off right and left, and then write some more cool characters to keep us reading. And what these characters really show us is that there are never any victories without sacrifices, and that also goes back to the idea of conflict. So if you want to write good characters, make sure they have some conflict. Yet another smart choice that George Martin made while writing these books is the narrative perspective. Every chapter has a different perspective characters. He has multiple perspective characters in every book. In fact, as each book has progressed, there have been more and more perspective characters. Now, the genius of this is it really does keep the reader's interest, because once we've been with one character for a while, you shift gears a little bit, things are seen from another character's perspective, and sometimes even you find yourself sympathizing with characters who are actually at conflict with each other. So it's a great writer who can make you sympathize with various sides of a conflict. So this really does justice to the complexity of people, but also to the complexity of the political situation in A Song of Ice and Fire. And finally, and this last point will sound familiar if you've been watching some of my other videos, Martin's books are great and they're going to last because they're also very archetypal. And he's such a good writer that you sometimes don't even realize that what you have in front of you is an archetype. But you think about it, the major characters like Jon and Daenerys and Bran and Arya, Tyrion, these are characters who are going on a type of hero's journey. Their character arcs are about finding themselves. And often they are orphans and bastards and abandoned people. And they each meet mentor figures along the way. For example, Arya has Jaqen H'ghar, and even earlier Syrio Forel, who some people think they're the same person actually. Or you have Jon Snow with Old Mormont at the Wall. And of course, Bran has the three-eyed crow to show him the way. So each of these characters is out there to find his or her tribe, to find their way in the world. And the reader is thus given multiple journeys to follow in what is a very complex, brutal world. So Martin is really brilliant at keeping his readers engaged, and he is going to stand the test of time, in my opinion, as one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time. Certainly one of the greatest influences on fantasy today. Next week, I'll be taking a look at another one of the greatest current influences on fantasy, and that would be Patrick Rothfuss and his Kingkiller Chronicles. So I hope you'll join me then. Until next time.